person on the bottom has markings on his face that read Revolution University.
The relief was temporary, and much of it has now expired. And so now we're seeing poverty rise again.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. This headline from Electronic Intifada should be incredible. However, the incredible is what we've come to expect from the Israeli government. Here are the details from the start of the EI article. Israeli General Effie Eitam minces no words about Palestinians. These are creatures who came out of the depths of darkness, he told the New Yorker's Jeffrey Goldberg in 2004. We will have to kill them all, Eitam said, before adding this merciful note. I don't mean all the Palestinians, but the ones with evil in their heads. Not only blood on their hands, but evil in their heads. Eitam has been nominated to head Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem, to which practically every foreign leader visiting Israel is brought to have their photo taken. And Eitam's comment was not some random exceptional thing. Eitam has a record of unapologetic brutality. We'll link to the EI article on thestruggle.org. Defense of Children International reports on this grim murder of a Palestinian youth. He was choked and beaten by 6 Israeli soldiers, according to eyewitnesses. His father told Middle East Eye, "The medics told us when they arrived, the soldiers didn't let them approach my son immediately," Abdul Rahman said. "It's like they were waiting for him to die before letting anyone touch him." The new COVID infection numbers for October 29th. This is the number of Americans who died of the disease that night. Now compare that to the numbers in Taiwan, the Chinese capitalist country of 24 million people. No deaths from COVID and no cases for 200 days. We live with massive government incompetence and negligence. The Gandhi Peace Award is coming up in 3 weeks, so we'll be talking about the upcoming free Zoom event. If you watch this show, you surely know it's being given to a Syrian-American medical doctor, Dr. Zahar Salul, and a Syrian white helmet rescue worker who has been given refuge in Canada, Maysoon Al-Misr. They're going to be introduced by 2 very well-known people. Salul will be introduced by Palestinian-American activist Linda Sasour. She was one of the organizers of the huge Women's March in 2017 and is also very prominent in the Muslim community. Maysoon Al-Misr will be introduced by Orlando von Einsiedel, who won the Academy Award in 2017 for directing the film The White Helmets. There will be music provided by Dylan Connor and Syrian artist Wasfi Masarani. There will be artwork shown by Akram Swedan, Mohammed Hafez, Mark Nelson, and Adiba Al-Namar. Another artist who has agreed to have some of her work shown, work about Syria, is Molly Crabapple. If you recall, we went to Brooklyn several years ago to see an exhibition of her work. This is the main library in Brooklyn, New York. Majestic doors as if one were entering a building in ancient Egypt or Rome. In May, Molly Crabapple, the artist and journalist, was interviewed there as an opening event for a book she helped create. It's called Brothers of the Gun, a memoir of the Syrian war. She and Marwan Hisham a Syrian refugee from Raqqa, wrote the account of Hisham and two friends living in Raqqa, a city liberated from Assad and then seized by ISIS. Original drawings on exhibit for several months. Here the drawing used for the cover, a man playing a gun as if it was a violin. This is not Raqqa, but Aleppo. Marwan Hisham attended the University of Aleppo, where protests like the one shown here took place before rebel groups took over part of the city. The person on the bottom has markings on his face that read, Revolution University. Note the attempt at solidarity, an unveiled woman holding a Quran, another holding a cross. A scene of protest. Assad's forces flung against the people. Marwan Hisham spoke at the event via Skype. He's in Turkey, forbidden to come to the U.S. because of Trump's Muslim ban, and unable to go back to Syria for fear of torture and murder at the hands of the Syrian government. Now part of Molly Crabapple's talk. She was in dialogue with writer Sinan Antoon. She was explaining to him how she met Marwan Hisham via social media and how casual remarks developed into this book.
But as I studied Arabic more, I became very close friends with him online. And one day I asked him, I was like, Marwan, do you have any, just photos of Raqqa? The sort of photos that I would have of New York, right? The sort of photos we all have of where we live. And he didn't have photos, but he said he would take some. And I was like, that's very dangerous. That's an incredibly dangerous thing. Don't do something dangerous. And of course, he didn't listen to me, and he went all around Raqqa, sneaking into hospitals for ISIS fighters and taking photos of scenes that completely contradicted the glossy propaganda the group was doing. For instance, children digging through the trash for things to sell. And he gave them to me. And I remember when I saw them the first time, it was like I was looking through another human's eyes at something that I wasn't supposed to see. It's something that all of the borders and all of the violence in the world had conspired for me not to be able to see, and yet there I was looking at it because of him. At that time, he told me that he liked to write political commentaries for himself to keep his English up. And I said, Marwan, why don't you write captions for these and we can publish them? And he did. And we ended up publishing a piece for Vanity Fair of scenes from inside ISIS-occupied Raqqa. 2 more collaborations followed. And as we got to know each other more, I started saying, Marwan, why don't we do a book together? No one's ever done anything like this. At this point, he was still living in Raqqa, and he told me that he had actually taken notes just sort of notes for memoirs that he planned to do one day when he was old, that he would email to himself because he couldn't keep paper in his house, because if ISIS came in and knocked down the door, they would find paper and arrest him. So he would email notes to himself. And so he liked my idea. And from there, Marwan illegally crossed into Turkey, and we began working very closely with each other over the course of the next 3 years. I would commute back and forth to Turkey every few months. I'd spend maybe 10 days each time, and I would sit with him. And we worked in this way that at the time when we embarked on it, we didn't realize why no other writers work this way, and now we do, which is that it's torture. And writers are just egomaniacal monsters, so this is a specific torture for them. So initially, Marwan wrote half of it, and I wrote half of it based on interviews with him. I would just sit next to him, and I'd be like, so Marwan, what was it like when we're at religious school, for instance, and he would tell me, and then I'd say, no, tell me, what were they singing? What was the specific song? What did you feel? Tell me more, tell me more, tell me more. And I would write next to him. But, and this is where the torture part comes in, then we would rewrite each other. He would sit down with my work and he would say, this is terrible. This is cliche. It was not like this whatsoever. And also, why are you spoon feeding people what a Sunni and what a Shia is? We have Google nowadays. Surely we don't need to, put in a 101 course like this. And also, can you get a little bit more sophisticated with time? And just damn, And then I would take his and I'd be like, Marwan, no one in America knows what you mean when you say the events in Hama. And he'd be like, everyone knows the events in Hama of 1982. What are you telling me? And I'm like, no, they don't. They don't. You can't drop that in. You need a little bit more. And so we basically fought a war where he was trying to make my work more real and sophisticated, and both in a literary sense, and also get what was authentic, what was true. And I was taking his work and in some ways trying to make it clear for a Western audience, but also in other ways just asking him about things that he might not have thought about. One thing I remember was after the ISIS invasion, he told me, Molly, it didn't seem like things changed that much in the first few days. And I was like, Marwan, when did they impose veils on women? Black chiffon veils that cover your eyes so you can't even see the proper sun. And he's like, oh yeah, I guess that was, my sisters hated that. Yeah, that was, about a week. I was like, okay, we should put that in then. That was a big change. So, we basically fought, we edited and edited and edited and edited each other until I want to say that every single sentence is probably a fusion of the two of us, the way that you make metal, right? And I think that we created something that's better than perhaps either of us could have done, certainly better than I could have done alone. But I understand exactly why it's not a typical way for authors to work anymore as well.
So are there any, you already addressed that, but are there any particular issues other than these that were points of contention and back and forth? Because, the work is done and it flows so seamlessly. And I think, as you said, it's wonderful, because the other difficulty is writing from the outside and writing from the inside. And this book seems to, frankly, with anything written about Syria or Iraq or Palestine, one always reads and is afraid and waiting for these problematic neo-Orientalist or self-orientalizing symptoms. But this seems to have, although there is sensitivity to the audience, but it seems to have been written to tell the story itself. But I guess, sorry, my question is long-winded, but what were some glitches that you fought really hard over? Any aspects or events other than these?
Well, I think one of the big things was I really believed that we needed to spend a lot of time in the book before the war, because I think that Americans, they don't know what Syria or what anything in the Middle East is like, and they have, as you said, deeply embarrassing Orientalist beliefs about it, that I felt that if we didn't speak about life before the war in the book, that they would just have no point of reference, and that it wouldn't... they wouldn't feel what things meant when they went away. And so we did disagree about that, and ultimately we did write a lot about the world before the war, and that was something that I was very grateful that we got to do. Another thing was, basically Marwan has complete contempt for books that spoon feed the audience, both that spoon feed the audience in the sense of taking things, like starting a memoir that starts with "I was born" and ends with the present. And I think when I started this book, I was thinking in a more like simplistic and journalistic way, and I didn't have the confidence. He had to play with time. And so one thing that he did was he structured the whole book, and he did all of these really interesting things with time and with weaving all of these elements in and out, with playing with different characters and having unanswered questions that aren't answered until the very last moment. And that was all him. And frankly, I wouldn't have been able to do that myself.
Well, I'm happy you brought that up, because one thing that struck me was on page 132, he talks about the compression of time in a way, and how living there under those conditions, 1 month equals years lived elsewhere, which reminded me of what a colleague and a friend said after the Arab uprisings turned into civil wars, and that he said at the time that in these last 6 years we've experience events of 50 years almost, that they're so monumental. But which brings me to your illustrations, because I don't know if this is a productive question, but I feel that in your illustrations one can see this depth in a way of a situation. So how is this intentional, or is this just comes to you naturally? It's almost like it's three-dimensional, even though it's not.
Thank you. So a lot of these illustrations, so my initial illustrations with Marwan were from photos that he took, but in a lot of this book, we were illustrating scenes that there were no photos of, right, that were just from his memory, which is something that I value particularly about art, that you can draw things that weren't captured with photos the first time. But the images that I'm particularly proud of are images of the protests, and there are these scenes that might have, I mean, maybe hundreds of, or maybe 100 figures in them. And the way that I would do these images was I would look at citizen video that was online, and there's so much citizen video out of Syria, right? This
is from a rally in the Syrian city of Morea, in the countryside outside of Aleppo. People demanding the fall of the Assad regime. Some politicians and right-wing business types are crowing because the economy grew massively larger over the last 3 months. It's true, but only because the economy was near comatose in the 3 months prior to that because of the pandemic closings. What's unfortunately more interesting is the numbers we see, the continued huge numbers of new first-time state unemployment claims, 751,000 last week. As we can see from this chart, that's about triple what it was any week last year. And from this chart, we can see that even back in 2010, at a low point in the Great Recession, the weekly number of new state unemployment claims never went over 440,000. So as a headline writer on Bloomberg News put it accurately, the quarterly boom is a mirage. And Wall Street wasn't fooled. Even with the glowing reports about the rise in the economy and big sales among tech, like Google, stocks had their worst week this week since March. Now from Democracy Now! News about the massive increase in poverty in the United States.
More than 54 million U.S. residents are struggling to afford food, according to the hunger relief organization Feeding America. And a new report finds more than 8 million people have been forced into poverty just since May. That's when the additional federal aid that kept millions afloat during the early months of the pandemic ended. Black and Latinx people, as well as children, have been particularly impacted. A new report finds the massive $2 trillion CARES Act, which sent households one-time payments and boosted unemployment checks with $600 additional a week through July, helped keep millions out of poverty. But since the additional aid has ended, the number of poor people has surged. For more, we're joined by Megan Curran, with the Center on Poverty and Social Policy at Columbia University. She has co-authored the report on increasing poverty rates in the U.S. during the pandemic. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Megan. It's great to have you with us. Just lay out the report's horrific findings.
Sure. Thanks very much for having me. What myself and my colleagues at the Columbia Center on Poverty have been trying to do is track the real-time effect on families of the, continuing crisis. One of the biggest challenges is that the way we traditionally measure poverty in this country is on an annual basis, and there's usually a time delay. So that's imperfect in normal times, but we know that 2020 is far from normal. And so it's something that calls for new tools. What we've tried to do most recently is estimate the monthly poverty rates in the U.S., so trying to look at what happened when families went out of work very sharply, but also what happened when the federal relief came in. And we found three main things. The first is that Congress did the right thing early on with the CARES Act in particular, the stimulus checks and the expanded unemployment benefits. The combination prevented what could have basically been the worst spike in poverty in 50 years. The second thing, however, is the bad news, which is that these successes are quickly being lost. The relief was temporary, and much of it has now expired. And so now we're seeing poverty rise again. But the third piece is kind of a silver lining in that we know what works now, getting cash out to households directly. And so we know that families can be protected again, but it does require action at the federal level.
And Megan, can you talk specifically about the impact of this poverty on children? 2.5 million children have been pushed into poverty since May. Is that right?
Yeah. So, the important thing to note is that, child poverty in the U.S., even before the crisis hit, was high and, arguably much too high for as wealthy a nation as we are. In the years coming up to it, even when the economy appeared strong, we had, more than 13 million children living below the poverty line. And just to put that in context, that's, we're talking about trying to get by on about $28,000 a year for a family of four, if you're in sort of an average cost city. And so it's not a generous level that we're talking about, but so many children were already living below that number, and we have now seen, another 2.5 million children fall below that income level just since May. And we know that also it's not hitting all kids equally. The gap in poverty, is stark between for Black and Latino children. It's 2.5 times higher than it is for whites, for white children. And so we need to, recognize that this was a problem beforehand, but it has been seriously it has been seriously magnified by this crisis.
And Megan, as you mentioned, Congress made the right decision early on in passing the CARES Act, which was the largest economic stimulus package in U.S. history. But there were a number of people who were excluded from the CARES Act. Could you talk about who was excluded and what the impact of that exclusion has been on them?
Yeah, the CARES Act, in our analysis and other researchers who have been looking at this, is found to be, so important and really, temporarily successful for families that were able to receive it. But we know that unfortunately, some, even though they were technically eligible, were at risk of not receiving it. There were about 12 million individuals identified who were at risk of maybe not receiving the stimulus check, even though they were eligible for it. And that's because they may not have filed taxes recently because they have such low incomes that they were not required to do so, that it required a lot of extra steps and the onus on the families themselves to figure out that they actually needed to apply for it. That put them at risk for not receiving it. But there were also a number of folks who were just explicitly left out of the legislation when it was passed. So that ranged, across a couple different population groups. We saw high school and college students left out of the stimulus checks if they were over the age of 17 and still claimed as dependents for tax purposes, which most of them were because they're in school by their families. They were left out of the checks right at the same time that they were, facing, rapidly increasing costs with having to switch to virtual learning overnight and all of these things. We know some, and that was about 10 million 17 to 24-year-olds across the country who were left out. We know another 5 million older adults with serious health issues also were left out of the stimulus checks, again, because they're claimed as dependents. They can't live alone in many instances. They and their carers did not receive emergency assistance for them. And one of the biggest populations that was excluded was children and adults in immigrant families, and about 15 million, it's estimated, individuals in immigrant families were left out. And this, most of these kids would have been U.S. citizen children. But the exclusions were particularly harsh here because if just one adult in the family did not have a Social Security number, no one in the family, regardless of, citizenship status or green card status, were able to receive the payment. And so that has, huge implications for families in every state.
What should a new stimulus package look like? And we only have a minute, Megan Curran. I mean, you have, since the beginning of the pandemic, enormous wealth inequality. The wealth of U.S. billionaires has surged $931 billion. And yet, when you look at the number of people who've not only plunged into poverty, but hunger, how do you correct this? It was seen as also an enormous corporate bailout.
Yeah, I think what we need to recognize is that, we need to get more cash to families, and it needs to be accessible to as many families as possible without exclusions, and it needs to be consistent. We know that, another one-time check, while very welcome for many families, isn't going to be enough. Continuing unemployment benefits, the $600 top-up weekly payments, along with the expansions that included those who are usually not covered, need to be continued. We need to get regular cash assistance, on a monthly basis, if not more frequent, if possible, to families who are not covered by unemployment. And we need to make sure that there are other protections in place, increased access to food for kids. You can increase the SNAP benefit levels. You can put in more housing protections so that there's rent relief and protections against evictions. And basically, you just need to make sure that families know that they can count on this for the duration of the crisis, because we're seeing with, continued unemployment claims and continued surges in cases, this crisis is not going away right now. And so the relief needs to be in place for as long as families need it.
That's our program for today. Be safe, folks, but stay active. I'm Stanley Heller for The Struggle.